Wealth Attraction Research. WAR. War. Economic Population Bonds. Wealth Attraction Research. WAR. War. Economic Population Bonds. You're listening to Wealth Attraction Research. WAR. War. Economic Population Bonds. Presented by Hakeem Alibokis Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc. Presented for World Reading Club in association with UniquilibriuM. This edition's reading focus comes to us from the Little Book of Economics and How Money Works. Starting in the Little Book of Economics, there is a section called Population Growth Keeps Us Poor, Demographics and Economics. And then following on that will be bonds from How Money Works. These two are being done separately from Wealth of Nations Today, which I recorded previously, and then I also recorded for Babylon's Banksters, because the section in Wealth of Nations was very long, and I was actually only able to get through part one of that, which is fine. There's a part two in there about inequality. But let's get through this right away. This is going to be a short one about... where we get the title from this is from the How Money Works is about bonds, and here in the Little Book of Economics is about population growth keeps us poor, demographics and economics. So let's get started. The Little Book of Economics. Population growth keeps us poor, demographics and economics. In context, focus is on growth and development. Key thinker, Thomas Malthus, born 1766, died 1834. Before him, in the 17th century, mercantilists thought argues that a large populace benefits the economy. So in 17th century, mercantilist thought argues that a large populace benefits the economy. In 1785, French philosopher Marquis de Condorcet argues for social reform to raise living standards. Maybe his name is Condorcet, but he argues, the French for Marquis de Condorcet or Condorcet argues for social reform to raise living standards. 1793, English philosopher William Godwin advocates the redistribution of national resources to help the poor. And after that, after the key thinker Thomas Malthus, we have in the 1870s, we have Karl Marx attacks Malthus's ideas, characterizing him as a reactionary defender of the status quo. And in 1968, U.S. ecologist Garrett Hardin warns of the dangers of overpopulation in his essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. Oh, that's what that's about. All right, continuing. Population growth keeps us poor. During the 18th century, enlightened thinkers began to consider the possibility of improving society's lot through wise social and economic reforms. The British economist Thomas Malthus was a pessimistic voice in this optimistic era, claiming that the growth of populations dooms societies to poverty. Malthus argued that the human sex drive causes faster and faster expansion of the populace. Food production would not keep up because the law of diminishing returns. case, food production would not keep up because of the law of diminishing returns. As more people work on a fixed amount of land, less and less output is added. The result is an ever-widening imbalance between the number of people and the supply of food. However, there is a counteracting force. Malthus saw that malnutrition and disease caused by a more limited food supply would lead to increased mortality and stop the imbalance from getting out of control. Less food to go around would also mean fewer children could be supported and the birth rate would fall. This would lessen the pressure on land, restoring living standards. The Malthusian trap. As well as preventing total starvation, changes in birth and death rates stop the population from benefiting from higher living standards for very long. Suppose that the economy has a windfall through the discovery of land. Extra land gives a one-time boost to food production and provides more food per person. People become healthier and the death rate falls. Higher living standards allow for more children. Together, these forces add to population growth. Food production cannot keep up, and the economy reverts to the original lower level of living standards. This is called the Malthusian trap. Higher living standards are always choked off by population growth. So whatever happens, the economy always reverts to the level of food output that is just enough to support a stable population. Malthus's version was one of economic stagnation, with the population eking out a living and its growth being checked by hunger and disease. However, his model, an economy of farmers toiling with simple tools on a fixed amount of land, was already out of step with the times by the turn of the 18th century. New techniques allowed more food to be produced from the same amount of land and labor. New machines and factories allowed more goods to be produced per worker. Technological progress meant that growing populations enjoyed ever higher living standards. By 2000, Britain had more than 3 times the population of Malthus's time, with incomes 10 times higher. Over time, technology has overcome the constraints of land and demographics. Malthus did not foresee this. Today, his ideas are echoed in fears that population levels are pushing against the capacity of the earth in ways that new technology cannot offset. So, today his ideas are echoed in fears that population levels are pushing against the capacity of the earth in ways that new technology cannot offset. I wonder if that's so. There's a flow chart here that is pretty simple to follow. Starts off with the human sex drive causes the population to grow, which leads to growth in the food supply is unable to keep up, which leads to there is not enough food for all, some people die from hunger. And then it goes in 2 different places. One way it says the population decreases and the food supply is adequate again. The other way it goes is poor relief, welfare benefits would bring health to the poor but encourage them to have more children. And then that leads to population growth keeps us poor. But that goes back to, as there is not enough food for all, some people die from hunger, which goes back to population decreases, food supply is adequate, or to poor relief and would bring the poor and encourage. So that's the Malthusian trap demonstrated right there. And let's look at Thomas Malthus. He's the key thinker. Thomas Robert Malthus was born in Surrey, England in 1766 and was given a liberal education by his father, a country squire. His godfathers were the philosophers David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was born with a cleft palate and suffered from a speech defect. At Cambridge University, Malthus was tutored by a religious dissenter, William Friend, before being ordained into the Church of England in 1788. Like his teacher, he never shied away from controversy. In 1798, he published his essay on the principle of population, the work that would bring him notoriety. In 1805, the new East India College appointed him professor of political economy, a subject not yet taught at universities, which perhaps makes him the first academic economist. Malthus died of heart disease in 1834, aged 68. And also, he was too young to meet or even to be influenced by, I think, much, or just wasn't, by Adam Smith. Let's see what his key works are. 1798, an essay on the principle of population. In 1815, 17 years later, The Nature of Rent. And this would have been a while after 1776's Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith. And he was close by. He was in England, and Adam Smith is from Scotland. And finally, in 1820, Principles of Political Economy. There you have it. That was from the Little Book of Economics, Population Growth Keeps Us Poor, Demographics in Economics. And the next reading is going to be Meetings of Merchants End in Conspiracies to Raise Prices, Cartels and Collusion. Ooh, that's going to be the next one. All right. Kind of stuff I like to see. I like to hear about conspiracies. They're fun. All right, and then finally we're going to leave off here in bonds, some of the heavy work here in money, how money works, and that'll conclude this, and we'll be out of here. All right, so bonds. Let's take a look at bonds. All right, and how money works. Companies and governments sell bonds to raise money without issuing shares. They are effectively fixed-term loans bought by investors who receive interest until the end of that term. Interesting. Companies and governments sell bonds to raise money without issuing shares. They are effectively fixed-term loans bought by investors who receive interest until the end of that term. How it works. Bonds are securities for long-term debt, although they are not always held until the end of their term. The price of a bond rises and falls depending on current interest rates and on how likely investors feel the bond issuer is to repay the initial sum invested. There are different kinds of bonds, such as savings bonds, company bonds, and government bonds, also known as U.S. Treasury securities, and some can be traded between investors. In savings bonds, investors deposit a lump sum with a retail savings institution, such as a bank, receive regular interest, and are repaid the original sum in full. In other types of bonds, repayment of the original sum is not guaranteed, since the issuer could go bust. Because the risk of government default is so small, gilts are seen as the least risky type. Gilts, G-I-L-T-S. I guess that's a government insurance, something. I don't know what that term is. Hopefully it's around here somewhere. All right, and then finally, in this last and most boring part of this here, we have investing in bonds, and there's an example of a water company here. So investing in bonds. When choosing a bond, investors must balance the total sum received in interest against the likelihood of the capital sum, which is the initial cash investment. So when choosing a bond, investors must balance the total sum received in interest against the likelihood of the initial cash investment actually being repaid at the end of the term. They must also decide whether a bond offers good value by analyzing its current yield. This compares the interest paid by the bond with its current value on the second-hand market. Although bondholders have a slightly higher chance of being paid than shareholders if a company collapses, there is no guarantee of payment. But there is also, I like this one here that I'm looking at here, is that in savings bonds, investors deposit a lump sum with a retail savings institution, such as a bank, and they receive regular interest and are repaid the original sum in full. So I wonder, that's interesting. I got to look into that. That in depositing a lump sum with a bank and receiving regular interest, and then are repaid the original sum in full later. That sounds interesting. But there's something kind of like that I've been doing now, but I'm not even going to get into that right now about the money that I'm putting in that I'll get back later. Let's take a look. All right. Need to know. I'll finish that later. Let's do those key terms right now. Need to know. Face value. The initial price at which the bond was issued is known as the face value. Market or par value. The price at which a bond is traded is called the market or par value. Coupon. The amount of interest paid to bond investors is called a coupon. Yield. A general term that relates to the return on the capital invested in a bond. That's a yield. Savings bonds. Cash deposits on which a regular interest rate is paid. Cash deposits on which a regular interest rate is paid. That's a savings bond. It's kind of like a savings account, but this is called a savings bond. But this is because you get paid, as it said earlier, you get repaid the original sum in full. Okay. Securities. Financial instruments such as bonds that can be traded are called securities. Junk bonds. Bonds of highly risky companies are called junk bonds. And default. When a company fails to honor a repayment on a bond that it has sold to an investor. That's called a default. And let's take a look here at this imagery here. So we have investors pay into a company. This is about the water company. Investors pay into a company receiving a bond certificate in return. In this example, $1,000 is poured into the water company from the investor. The water company, by issuing bonds at $1,000, a water company receives loans of $1,000 from investors for each bond they wish to buy. In addition to promising to repay the loan, the company regularly pays interest, known as the coupon, to bondholders. And then we have, let's see, the yield calculation, the coupon amount, and over the bond price, which is 100 over 1, and the yield percent. Oh, I see this. We got a calculation here. All right. So the yield calculation. So, for example, if there's a coupon amount is $1,000, right? Which, remember, the coupon is the interest over 10. And so times 100 over 1 equals 10%. So, yep, 10%. So 10% interest. The current yield, the interest rate the bond is paying, expressed as a percentage of its market value. Year 1 yield equals $100. The market value of the bond is $1,000, and it is paying 10% interest. So the yield is $100. So they do this yearly. Let's take a look. Year 1 in the water company. The coupon is 10%, right? That's the interest, regularly pays interest. Which means the water company regularly pays out 10% of the face value of the bond, the price at which it was sold, as interest. As the face value is $1,000, the coupon is $100. Investors could also sell their bond certificates for $100. Could sell their bond certificates for $100. Interesting. All right. Continuing here, water company year 2. The company does well and is seen as a safe investment. So the bond's market value, the price other investors will pay for it, increases. Some investors may choose to sell their bond certificates for a 20% profit, but others will keep them for the regular interest. So now the bond market value is $1,200, and now it yields 8.33%. This is interesting. All right, so year 1 yield is 100. Year 2 yield equals 8.33%. At least at $1,200, the interest remains the same, but the bond yield falls to 8.33% as the bond provides 10% of $1,000 on a $1,200 investment. So let's see, moving on, year 3. Year 3, after a difficult year, the company looks less reliable, so the market value of its bond decreases. The bond still provides regular interest. Any new investors would receive the same interest payment, a higher rate of regular interest for a lower initial investment. So they still pay this time. The bond market value is now 800. Huh. And so year yield 3 is 12.5%. The interest the bond pays remains at 100, but the bond can now be bought for 800. The yield therefore rises to 12.5%. Interesting. So because of the initial bond sold at $1,000 and the yield, which is the coupon, the interest that gets paid, always has to be, it seems like, at $100 or what it was at the original cost. Even if the price goes down because the company seems riskier, the new investors still get paid the same. So in a sense, it might be a good idea to go in to buy a bond when it's less, when you'll still get paid more of that yield. That's interesting. All right. And then we have year 4 of this water company. At the end of the bond's term, the company repays the original capital sum plus any interest that has accrued on a specific date known as the maturity date. The bondholder receives no further interest once the bonds have matured. And so return on bond equals $300. The bondholder receives a full redemption of $1,000, which is the original, plus the total interest of $300 that has been accrued over the 3 years. Not bad. Okay. So look in some bonds here, although they might not be the best. Okay, so the highest ever bond rate offered by U.S. banks due to high interest rates in the 1980s was 16.5%. Oh, thank goodness. That was a very short one, because I had done a very long reading earlier of Wealth of Nations by itself, in which I'll be back tomorrow for that part 2 in Wealth of Nations. So that'll be the next installment, which part 2 of Wealth of Nations is in this whole section of Wealth of Nations that I had read earlier in a separate talk and reading. Is the whole part of this chapter 10, which is called Of Wages and Profit in the Different Employments of Labor and Stock. And part 1 is called Inequalities Arising from the Nature of the Employments Themselves. And part 2 and the next one is called Inequalities Occasioned by the Policy of Europe. Also, as I mentioned before, when I do get to it, the little book of economics is going to be a little exciting. I like this. It's called Meetings of Merchants End in Conspiracies to Raise Prices, Cartels and Collusion. Looks like that one should be interesting. And then the very next thing here in the little, the How Money Works is called Derivatives. All right. Derivatives. Okay, so that'll be what's coming up next. You've been listening to Wealth Attraction Research, WAR, WAR, Economic Population Bonds, presented by Hakeem Ali Bokus Alexander on Spreaker, Social Podcasting, and Wisdom, Social Audio Inc., presented for World Reading Club in association with ExercisingYourMind.com and UniquilibriuM.